guys, it's Kevin again, my review for The Goldfinch. And what The Goldfinch is essentially about is we center on our main character, Theo Decker, and he is someone who has suffered a very personal tragedy. He lost his mother in this terrorist attack in this art museum and things like that, and pretty much since then, his life has never been the same. Tons of just terrible things are happening to him, and the only piece of her that he has left is this painting known as the Goldfinch, and basically we follow Theo throughout his life as he tries to retain this painting and hopefully try to get through life without, the person that he cared about most, and that's really all I'm going to say. So the Goldfinch overall, I was very excited for this film. I mean, especially coming off the heels, Joe Crowley coming off the heels of Brooklyn, a film that I think was just so sweet and simple, but one that I think was very effective. And I recently rewatched it in preparation for this film, and yeah, I still very much feel that same way. I do think that that Brooklyn is a very simple film, but that's why I was even more excited for The Goldfinch, because it looked like it was so much more larger scale in that way. It was a story that seemed like it was really gonna get to me. It had a cast that I was just so behind. I adored the trailers. I was adoring all of the marketing. I just could not wait to see this film. It was definitely one of my most anticipated for the rest of the year. And it sucks. This is a absolutely atrocious film that is way more of a misfire than I ever could have imagined it being. It absolutely is worth all of the negative buzz that it's gotten, and definitely is a huge disappointment on all fronts. But we'll get more into that, starting off with the cast. Which, I'll be honest, there's not a lot to talk about here in terms of acting. There really isn't. But there is one standout in this movie, one performance here that I do think was actually very effective, and that is Oakes Fegley as the younger version of Theo, who I thought did do a very strong job here. He carries the movie quite well. You really do empathize for this kid because of what he has gone through. He communicates it in a way that the movie itself can't, and I think he really did elevate the role in that way. There's a really great scene with him, especially in him cradling this newspaper, and it's heartbreaking just seeing what this kid has gone through, and Fegley does do a really great job with that for sure, and I thought that he poured a lot of emotion into this performance, way more than honestly was required of his role, and he gave way more layers to this character that I feel like a lesser actor wouldn't, but Fegley really did kill it here. You really do feel that bond he had with his mother and how that's been ripped away from him, and now he's just in a place where he doesn't really know where to turn, and I think he did do overall a really strong job here for the most part. Unfortunately, though, the same can't be said about Ansel Elgort, who, as hard as he's trying, he really is trying in this role, has almost nothing to do. Adult Theo is barely focused on. There really isn't a lot going on there. And again, Elgort's a really great actor, but his acting here, it just doesn't really work for this role. He's far too stoic, he's far too quiet, and he just doesn't do a very good job with showing the emotional development of this character, and I just didn't think that he was very well casted here, and that's very unfortunate to say, because I do think Elgort is a phenomenal actor, but this was not the right role for him. I feel like if you got a different actor, they could have pulled it off a lot better, but Elgort just simply wasn't able to communicate it. It's very unfortunate for sure, because I do think he's a wonderful actor. But besides Fegley, the only other performance I can say that genuinely did impress me was Jeffrey Wright. I thought he did do a really good job. He's kind of like this caretaker that forms this bond with Theo, and I thought he did do a really strong job here for sure. I really enjoyed their bonding throughout the film. Everyone else in this cast, though, they're either completely wasted or they're just straight up terrible. I'll just say right now, actors like Nicole Kidman, Sarah Paulson, Luke Wilson, they have their moments. They do, for sure. They definitely do have their moments. It's just they have absolutely nothing to work with here. They're almost completely wasted. Nicole Kidman especially, holy shit is she wasted in this film. She gives nothing to do, and yeah, so you have all these great actors that are pretty much wasted, but then, of course, the bad. Look, I really do love this actor a lot, but Finn Wolfhard here, whoa, this did not work at all. I was very, very surprised. Look, I went into this film a little bit skeptical when it came to him. I didn't really know if he was the right casting choice, and I can very much confirm that this is easily one of the worst casting choices that I have seen all year. I mean, there is not a single second of this movie where you are convinced that Wolfhard is this foreign exchange student that forms this bond with Theo. He is way too over the top. He's basically playing a stereotype, and it just falls so incredibly flat. And look, again, I think Wolfhard is a fantastic actor, but similar to Elgort, I just don't think he was well casted here. I don't think this was the right role for him at all. The accent especially is extremely unconvincing. It's very distracting, and like I said, I was worried about it going into the film, but it was far more distracting than I ever could have imagined, and I just didn't like him here at all. I thought he was severely miscasted. The older version of him isn't as bad, I will say that, but Wolfhard really brought this movie down, and it doesn't help that he has a lot of screen time as well. So yeah, most of these actors, it's a combination of them either being wasted or them just being flat out terrible, such as Finn Wolfhard. So again, not really much to say here acting-wise, unfortunately. But now we get to the directing and the writing, which, oh boy, I got a lot to say here. Look, Joe Crowley, I think he's a really good director. I liked what he did with Brooklyn. He had a lot of passion and emotion that he poured into that. He did a really good job with, I think, blending the sweetness but also the tragedy of that story, and I think he did a really good job with that for sure. And it seemed like with this film, he was going to helm it quite well. And honestly, I hate to say it, but there is almost no directorial flair here whatsoever. It very much seemed like Crowley took on this story, not realizing just how intense of a project this was going to be, and he was so overwhelmed by it that he just had no idea what to do with it vision-wise, and it very much does show here. It's very hard to tell what he's actually trying to go for with this film. The film doesn't really have a set tone in that way. You would think that it's a very emotionally challenging film, but it really isn't. It's something that I can't really put my finger on. I really can't tell what Crowley was trying to go for here, and I think his directing, it just felt kind of stagnant. Like, I was watching the movie thing, this movie really is not that well directed, especially when we get to the third act, when it turns into something completely different entirely. I mean, the movie tries to be this weird hodgepodge of, like, it's a mystery, but it's also a family drama, but it also is a coming-of-age film. I mean, it just has no idea what it wants to be, and sadly, a lot of that is due to the directing here. I just don't think that Crowley did a very good job helming this film, and that's very surprising to say considering how great of a job he did with Brooklyn, but I also think it's because Brooklyn just had a far more simpler story. It was an easier film to direct. This film was far more challenging, and I think it was a little too much for Crowley. I think he really needed to direct some other films, not on this scale, but at least close to this scale, and then direct something this demanding, because he clearly was not ready for it, and it very much does show here. The writing, though, holy shit, the writing is on a whole other level of terrible, and it's easily the worst thing about this entire film. And I mean, I really should not be surprised by this, considering that the writer of this movie is the same writer of The Snowman, or at least one of the writers of The Snowman. So, yeah, it very much does show, and I should have known going into this that that was a red flag, because you guys know, whew, that is a rough screenplay for sure. And look, this is not on that level. I will say this right now. This is not on that level. There are certainly points that are, though. This entire film, similar to The Snowman, it feels so broken. It feels like a movie that was just impossible to make, and I've heard many people say that, like, the book itself is an unfilmable novel, and it very much does show here. There's simply just too much material here that they're able to adapt, and as a result, what should be the main plot of this movie really isn't. The plot I told you, that's not really the plot of this movie. The Goldfinch itself, there's a large portion of this movie where it doesn't play a role at all. It's not even really till the third act when it starts to play a much bigger role in the film, and it just doesn't work in the way that it should, especially considering that the whole thing is supposed to be contingent upon how much you care about this loss that Theo has gone through. The film does absolutely nothing to illustrate why this was important to him. His mother, as a character, isn't even one. She's presented in the shadows. Every so often, we'll get, like, a glimpse of her. You know, we'll hear a little bit about her, we'll see her and Theo, but we don't even see all of her until literally the final scene of this movie. I'm not kidding you. Literally, the final scene of this movie, that's when you actually get to see his mother in a full glimpse. You know, fully, you get to see her and their relationship fully displayed. But up till then, the whole thing is basically presented as a mystery. And as a result, we have a film that is far more cynical than it really should be. Any sort of emotional beats, they're just not there because we haven't spent any time with him and his mother. So even though, yes, it is sad what Theo's gone through, we don't really care because the film does absolutely nothing to show why this was so important to him. It tells us a lot of stuff, but it's a perfect example of show not tell. Instead, the film tries to focus on things that just seem pretty arbitrary. We focus a lot on Theo's stay with the Barber family, this family that's taking him in for a little bit. But the problem is, we don't get to see much of anything here. Him and Nicole Kidman's character, Samantha, for example, there's nothing with that relationship either. She's completely wasted as a character. The only reason that she probably got a bigger role is because she's Nicole Kidman, and even at that, they don't do much of anything with her as a character, and it's very disappointing to see. Same with the rest of the family. The only character that gets anything is the character of Kitsy, and even at that, it's just a really generic story between her and Theo. And I again, it really sucks because the things that I cared about most in this movie are things that are barely touched upon. I like the stuff that they attempted to give us with Theo and his mother. I think there was some interesting stuff there. But for me, the most interesting story in this movie isn't even really a huge part of it. It's this relation between the characters of Theo and Pippa. Pippa's a girl who she suffers from the same tragedy that Theo was involved in. She lost a parent. She's had very severe damage done to her head because of it, and you see these two really bond, and I thought it was honestly kind of sweet the way they were going about it. But it's cut so short. Pippa is nothing more than just a girl that Theo wants that he can't have, and that's it. That's all she is in this movie, and it's very disappointing because I could see where they were trying to go with it. I could see exactly what kind of story they're trying to tell there, but they don't center it on it at all. The movie seems to have no idea what its clear story is. And look, the first act of this movie, it's not that bad, again, because it's centering on the Barbers and Pippa, and I wasn't too annoyed by that, especially the Pippa stuff I actually was kind of liking. Once Finn Wolfhard's character is introduced, that's when this movie just completely fucking lost me. It turns into something different entirely that I absolutely hated. I hated everything about, where the film ends up going in its second and third act. Once the character of Boris comes in, who I just didn't care about at all. This character feels so shoehorned in. I get it, he's in the books, he's a very vital part of the book, but this felt like a character that just didn't have a place in this movie. The only reason he's here is because they need to get Theo there narratively, and they need someone to do that, so they shove Boris in here, and Boris just doesn't really work in this story, at least in the way it's told. It just isn't done very well at all because these two form this bond, and it's similar to what him and Pippa had, but a little bit different, and I just did not care about it, and I don't think they did a very good job with that. I will say, though, as much as that was annoying me, the stuff in the past, yes, it feels very fragmented. It feels like it's not as dived into. That's nothing compared to the present here. The present story itself is barely even touched upon. In fact, Ansel Elgort, the main actor in this movie, isn't even really in this all that much until the third act. He's shown every now and again, but a large part of the movie is dedicated to just overlong scenes of the past and us seeing Theo and his abusive father and his prostitute girlfriend that I just didn't care about. None of this stuff is interesting. Every single one of these characters, besides maybe Theo, who genuinely is a good character, is basically nothing more than a cliche, and it really does suck in that way, because I think these characters could be so much more well-developed, but that's really all they are at the end of the day. So when we get to that present day, it feels so... And because the movie concentrates so much on the past, once we get to the present, it feels so incredibly rushed. The film does a terrible job at showing what these characters have been through up till then. You know, we know what they went through then. We don't know what they're going through now. Theo especially, we have no idea what he's going through. The film will just randomly introduce things to us, you know, acting as if we know what they're talking about. There's one revelation especially, happens in the first act. You don't even find out what that means until, like, the end of the second act. It's absolutely ridiculous the way they go about it. It was so baffling to me. I could not believe the way that the present stuff was structured, because it just felt so rushed in that way. Theo doesn't seem like he's changed at all as a character. It's him, like, you know, meeting the barbers again, things like that. It's just not, it doesn't work. It's not written well at all, and I think the film would have benefited way more if it just cut back and forth rather than what it was doing, which is spend the majority of its time in the past and then give us, like, 45 minutes of the present. Guys, this movie's over 2 hours long. Most of it is spent in the past. Obviously, the present day is not going to work as well because that you needed to pepper that more throughout the film, and they just didn't do that, and as a result, it doesn't work at all. It also doesn't help that, like I said, aside from Theo, most of these characters are just completely unlikable. They're not just cliches, but they're characters that you genuinely don't like. I don't just dislike Boris because he feels shoehorned in. I don't like him because he doesn't seem like he's a good influence for Theo. The film is clearly trying to make it as such, but the way it's presented in the story, this does not seem like a healthy relationship. This does not seem like a good friendship in that way. They don't do a good job with that. The barbers are just snooty rich people pretty much. There's really nothing to them aside from that. They try to give something to Nicole Kidman where, like, she's much more welcoming and open arms in that way, but there's nothing to her, so I don't care. And then his stepdad is just the abusive stepdad. So most of these characters, not only do you not care about, but you also just don't like them at all. They're so unlikable in that way, and the film does absolutely nothing to try to flesh them out more, and it's very disappointing. And as a result, like I said, the things that I like are very small elements of the story. Jeffrey Wright's character also, you know, he's probably one of the only genuinely good people in this story, and he has almost nothing to do here. So yeah, it really didn't work at all. And the central story here of the Goldfinch, I hate saying it, but it's incredibly cynical the way they do it. It's honestly kind of disgusting. They take what's supposed to be this really sad and just very, you know, this very dense tragedy that's really nuanced and complex and really takes this character on an emotional journey, and instead they turn it into just a generic mystery. And the third act of this movie, this just becomes a generic mystery film, and it feels incredibly disingenuous. Any sort of care they try to put into that relationship just felt so disingenuous because of that to me. I was honestly baffled by where they ended up going in the third act. I was baffled throughout the whole movie, but the third act especially, I could not believe where I was watching. It is an absolute disaster. It genuinely seems like they had no idea how to end this film in a satisfying way. So they just went about they just gave it the most craziest ending they could possibly think of. And it very much seems that way here. And it just ruins almost the entire film. The film is already trash, but this just really, I think, just sealed the deal on just how much of a disaster this film truly was. I should also reiterate that the dialogue here is all kinds of awful. There is one joke especially involving the Boris character. There's a certain character that Theo resembles, and Boris constantly refers to him by name, and it doesn't seem like something where, oh, this is just like a nickname that he's giving him as a friend. No, it seems like they're doing this as like a running gag, and they drag this joke into the ground. It's never funny. It's like the definition of just LCD type humor, and it was so annoying in that way. It's probably one of the worst jokes that I've seen in any film this year. I hated what they were trying to do here, and again, it just shows how tonally inconsistent this film really is. It doesn't know what it wants to be, and that joke alone, that, again, I'm not going to get into, but that attempt at humor very much does show how just confusing of a film this really is. So yeah, the entire screenplay is pretty much just a mess. There really isn't a clear story at all, any sort of theme. It's very hard to tell what we're supposed to latch onto here, what we're really supposed to take away. It's just very unclear, and so it just makes for a really excruciating experience overall. I will give the movie this, though. As bad of a film as it is, the cinematography is gorgeous here. And I mean, that's not surprising considering that it is by Roger Deakins, who is the greatest cinematographer working right now. And he does a really good job with giving this film a really nice, just delicate and beautiful look to it that the rest of the movie just can't convey. There are some scenes, though, that are really well filmed for sure, and I'm not going to deny that at all. And the score as well. I mean, yeah, it's a really bad movie, but it's one of those films where, like, you can listen to the score and you're like, that's actually a really good score. That actually works very well for this film. And similar to the cinematography, it gets more emotion than the script can't really convey. The problem is, even though these things are really good, they still weren't enough to save this movie for me. I was constantly taken out of how good the cinematography was because of how terrible the script was. I was taken out of how great the score was. I didn't care about how great the score was because of the fact that the movie itself was garbage. And the editing, again, is a huge problem for sure. Like I said, this movie is so choppily edited. A large majority of it is spent on the past, and the editing is just genuinely terrible here, especially when it decides to come back to the present. It feels so arbitrary. It feels like the only reason they did that is because, oh yeah, we have to somewhat establish what's going on there, right? Every so often, especially in the first two acts, every so often, like the third act is mostly the present, but the first two acts, most of it's in the past, but every so often when they cut back to the present, it was so awkward. I was like, why are we cutting back here? Is this the end of the flashbacks? Like, are we going to focus on the present now? And then we do for a bit, but then we keep going back to the flashbacks, and it didn't make any sense. The editing for this movie is genuinely terrible. It's not well edited at all. It's also far too long. I mean, the story we have now, as it is, there is no reason why this movie should be 2.5 hours. There really is no reason for it. It should at most be 2 hours. Again, maybe if you added a little bit more meat to chew, then yeah, you could justify the runtime, but as it is, there is no reason for it to be as long as it was. And I sat there just so relentlessly bored and just waiting for this to end, and it feels like one of those films that just never is going to end, especially the third act, which is just so dragged out. Just, the editing is just terrible here. Ultimately, the Goldfinch is just a huge disaster on all fronts. It wastes a very talented cast. It really doesn't have a very good vision of what it wants to be at all. It seems very confusing. It skips so many key elements of the story, and it wastes what could have been, I think, a really emotionally gripping and powerful story about loss, about regret, but instead, it's just all amounts to a generic mystery. That's all this really turns out to be. There's some things here that could have been interesting, but they really don't dive into it at all. It does have a strong performance from Oaks Fegley. The cinematography is beautiful, and the score itself I really did enjoy. But other than that, there just isn't really a lot that can save this film for the most part. And so as a result, we have what is easily one of the most tone-deaf films of the entire year that was honestly pretty hard to get through, I have to say. This film really disappointed me in so many ways, and I'm absolutely going to give the Goldfinch overall a D. Ugh, I can't believe how disappointing of a film this was. Seriously, it's gonna take a lot for a film to disappoint me more than this one did. Because as of right now, this is easily the biggest disappointment of the entire year for me. I mean, wow, I was not expecting this to be as bad as it was. But either way, guys, this is my review. Hope you guys enjoy it. Let me know if you guys saw this movie overall, if your thoughts, and we'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.